The studio lights were already on when the audience began to settle into their seats. The energy in the room felt normal at first, the kind that always comes before a live talk show goes on air. People chatted quietly, staff moved quickly with headsets on, and the hosts prepared their notes. Nothing about the morning suggested that it would turn into a moment people would talk about for weeks. This episode of the show had been planned as a thoughtful conversation about movies, culture, and the changing voice of Hollywood. One guest was known for his calm presence and long career behind and in front of the camera. The other was famous for his strong opinions and fearless honesty. Both were legends in their own way, and that was exactly why producers believed the discussion would be meaningful. As the cameras started rolling, the conversation began smoothly. The hosts welcomed viewers at home and introduced the topic of the day. They spoke about how films influence society and how actors often become symbols of bigger ideas. The guest in the studio listened closely, sitting upright, hands folded, his expression steady. On the large screen nearby, the remote guest appeared relaxed at first, nodding as others spoke. At the beginning, everything stayed polite. Each person took turns speaking. There were small smiles, light jokes, and a few moments of shared agreement. The audience responded with gentle applause, and the hosts seemed relieved. For a while, it felt like just another episode that would end quietly and be forgotten by the next news cycle. But slowly, the tone began to change. One comment led to another. A simple disagreement about responsibility turned into a deeper debate about influence and public behavior. The guest in the studio spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded measured and firm. He believed that public figures should be thoughtful and reserved, especially on live television. The remote guest saw things differently. He leaned closer to the camera, his voice becoming stronger. He spoke with emotion, explaining that silence can feel like approval and that speaking out is sometimes a duty. His passion was clear, and some audience members nodded along, while others shifted in their seats. The hosts tried to keep balance. They thanked both guests and reminded everyone that different opinions are part of healthy discussion. They smiled, but their eyes told a different story. They could sense the tension building, even if viewers at home had not noticed it yet. As the conversation continued, interruptions became more frequent. A sentence would start but not finish. A response would come faster than expected. The calm rhythm of the show began to crack. The guest in the studio remained mostly quiet during these moments, but his body language changed. His shoulders stiffened, and his jaw tightened slightly. During a brief pause, the camera cut to the hosts. One of them quickly shifted the topic, hoping to reset the mood. For a few minutes, it worked. The discussion returned to films and careers. Stories from the past were shared. Laughter returned, though it felt forced. Behind the cameras, staff members exchanged looks. They had seen difficult moments before, but something about this felt different. This was not just disagreement. It felt personal. The kind of tension that grows when two people feel deeply misunderstood. As the show moved closer to its first break, one final comment changed everything. It was not shouted. It was not dramatic. It was said plainly, but it carried weight. The remote guest questioned the idea of staying neutral and suggested that avoiding strong words could be seen as weakness. The studio grew quiet. The audience stopped reacting. Even the hosts paused for a second longer than usual. The guest in the studio looked up, eyes focused, expression unreadable. For the first time since the show began, he spoke without hesitation. His voice was calm, but firm. He explained that respect matters, especially in shared spaces. He said that conversations should build understanding, not turn into attacks. His words were slow and clear, and each sentence felt deliberate. The remote guest responded quickly, defending his point. His tone grew sharper, and the distance of the screen seemed to make the exchange feel even colder. The hosts tried to step in, but the moment had already taken its own direction. Then the show went to commercial. The red light above the camera turned off, and the room released a breath it had been holding. The audience began whispering. Staff moved fast. A producer approached the guest in the studio, speaking quietly. On the screen, the remote guest waited, arms crossed, clearly frustrated. No one raised their voice. There was no shouting behind the scenes. Instead, there was a serious conversation about tone, respect, and the direction of the show. The guest in the studio listened, then spoke briefly. His message was simple. He would not continue if the discussion stayed hostile. Time moved quickly. The countdown to return from break began. Decisions had to be made fast. The hosts adjusted their notes. The control room buzzed with activity. The atmosphere felt heavy, like something important was about to happen. As the seconds ticked down, the audience sensed the shift. This was no longer just a talk show episode. It was becoming a moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and debated. When the cameras were about to turn back on, everyone wondered the same thing. Would the conversation continue as planned, or had it already gone too far to turn back? No one in that studio knew yet that this was only the beginning. When the show returned from commercial, the mood felt different right away. The audience could sense it before anyone spoke. The smiles on the hosts' faces were polite but tight, and their voices carried a careful tone. It was clear that something serious had happened during the break, even though viewers at home had not seen it. The guest in the studio sat still, his posture calm but firm. He did not look angry, but he no longer looked relaxed either. On the screen, the remote guest appeared tense. His arms were crossed, and his eyes stayed fixed on the camera. Both men seemed ready to speak, yet neither rushed into it. One of the hosts gently reintroduced the conversation. She thanked both guests for staying and reminded everyone that live television can bring strong emotions. Her words were meant to smooth things over, to guide the discussion back onto safe ground. For a brief moment it worked. They spoke again about films, about long careers, about moments that shaped their lives. The guest in the studio shared a short memory from early in his career, something quiet and personal. The audience responded warmly. The tension softened, just slightly. But the calm did not last. The remote guest shifted the topic again, returning to the earlier disagreement. His voice was controlled, but the emotion was still there. He explained that he believed silence from powerful voices can cause harm. He spoke as if he was carrying the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, and he wanted others to feel that weight too. The guest in the studio listened without interrupting. When it was his turn, he spoke slowly. He said that everyone has the right to speak, but also the responsibility to respect shared spaces. He explained that shouting over others or pushing personal views too hard can shut people down instead of opening minds. The difference between them became clear. One believed in speaking loudly and directly, no matter the cost. The other believed in restraint and timing. Neither approach was wrong, but the clash between them felt unavoidable. The host stepped in again, trying to find common ground. They spoke about how people can disagree while still learning from one another. Their voices were calm, but their eyes kept moving between the guests, watching for signs of another spark. Behind the scenes, the control room was tense. Producers followed every word closely. Fingers hovered over buttons. Everyone knew that one wrong sentence could push the moment past the point of control. Then it happened. The remote guest interrupted mid-sentence. It was not loud, but it was sharp. He questioned whether calmness in moments like this was just another form of avoidance. The words hung in the air, heavier than he may have intended. The audience fell silent again. The guest in the studio looked straight ahead for a few seconds before responding. When he spoke, his tone remained even, but there was no warmth in it now. He said that being calm does not mean being weak, and that respect is not the same as fear. He added that no one should be pressured to perform anger to prove they care. The hosts tried to interrupt, but the exchange continued. The rhythm of the show slipped further away. This was no longer a guided discussion. It was two strong personalities standing their ground. Viewers at home later said they could feel the shift through the screen. It was not dramatic shouting or insults. It was something quieter, more uncomfortable. A clash of values happening in real time with nowhere to hide. Another break was called sooner than planned. As the cameras cut away, the room filled with movement. A producer approached the guest in the studio again, speaking quickly but respectfully. Another staff member focused on the screen, communicating with the remote guest through his earpiece. The hosts leaned toward each other, whispering. The guest in the studio spoke calmly to the producer. He explained that he was willing to continue, but not if the conversation turned into constant confrontation. He said the show deserved better, and so did the audience. On the other side, the remote guest expressed frustration. He felt limited by the format and believed his message was being softened. He insisted that strong moments are sometimes necessary to wake people up. Time pressure made everything harder. The show was live. Decisions had to be made in seconds, not minutes. The control room weighed the risks. Letting the argument continue could lead to something they could not control. Cutting it short could spark backlash. As the countdown to return from break began, a choice took shape. The hosts were informed quietly. Their expressions changed. One of them nodded slowly, understanding what was coming. The audience noticed the shift again, the feeling that something important was about to happen. When the cameras turned back on, the hosts thanked the remote guest for his time and contribution. Their words were polite but final. The screen went dark a moment later. In the studio, the silence was thick. The guest in the studio remained seated, hands resting calmly. The hosts took a breath and moved on to the next segment, but their voices carried a different weight now. At home, viewers were confused. Social media began to light up almost immediately. People asked questions. Clips were shared. Opinions formed fast, often without full context. Back in the studio, the rest of the show continued, but the energy never fully recovered. Everyone knew that what had just happened would not stay contained within those walls. The guest in the studio finished the episode professionally, thanking the hosts and the audience. When the cameras finally shut down, he stood, nodded politely to the crew, and walked off the set without saying much. Outside the studio, the world was already reacting, and this was only the start. The moment the episode ended, the studio felt unusually quiet. The audience clapped politely, but the sound faded fast. People gathered their things more slowly than usual, whispering to one another as they stood. Everyone sensed they had just witnessed something uncommon, something that could not be brushed off as normal television tension. Behind the cameras, staff members moved with purpose. Some checked their phones, already seeing messages appear online. Others focused on shutting down equipment, their faces serious. The energy that usually followed a live show was missing. There was no laughter, no relaxed chatter, only questions. The guest who had remained in the studio thanked a few crew members with a nod. His expression stayed composed, but there was a heaviness in his eyes. He walked down the hallway without stopping, his steps steady and unhurried. He did not look back. In another room, producers gathered around screens showing live reactions. Clips from the show were already circulating. Short videos, cut without context, spread quickly. Some headlines framed the moment as bold and decisive. Others described it as uncomfortable and shocking. The hosts sat together, replaying the moment in their minds. They knew that whatever happened next was out of their control. Live television has a way of escaping its own boundaries once it reaches the outside world. Within an hour, the story had taken on a life of its own. Online discussions grew fast. People who had not watched the full episode formed opinions based on short clips. Supporters praised calm leadership and restraint. Critics argued that strong voices were being silenced. The conversation became less about what happened and more about what people believed it represented. Entertainment writers began asking questions. Some reached out to the network for comment. Others speculated freely, filling gaps with assumptions. Every word was analyzed. Every pause was given meaning. Meanwhile, the guest who had been cut from the segment sat quietly somewhere else, watching the reactions unfold. Those close to him described a mix of frustration and disappointment. He believed his message had been misunderstood. He felt that passion had been mistaken for aggression. On the other side, the guest who stayed felt no victory. According to those around him, he was not interested in headlines or praise. He believed the situation should never have reached that point. For him, it was about boundaries, not dominance. As the day went on, requests for interviews came in. Public relations teams weighed options carefully. Speaking too soon could make things worse. Staying silent could allow the story to twist further. By evening, the network released a brief statement. It was neutral and carefully worded. It spoke about respecting diverse opinions and maintaining a respectful environment for discussion. It avoided assigning blame. The statement did little to slow the debate. Fans replayed the footage again and again. Some focused on body language. Others listened closely to tone. Many projected their own experiences onto the situation. For some, it reminded them of being talked over. For others, it felt like a lesson in self-control. Late-night shows referenced the moment with humor, but even jokes carried an edge. Commentators pointed out how rare it is for tension like that to unfold so clearly on daytime television. Inside the network offices, conversations continued. Executives reviewed policies. Producers discussed whether the situation could have been handled differently. No one wanted a repeat, but no one could deny that the moment had captured attention. The next morning, headlines were everywhere. Some framed the moment as a firm stand against chaos. Others called it an overreaction. A few questioned whether live shows should handle such strong personalities differently. The story had moved far beyond the studio. The guest who had remained composed received private messages of support from colleagues who admired his restraint. At the same time, he also received criticism from those who felt he should have been more flexible. The guest who was cut off received a different wave of messages. Many praised his honesty and courage. Others urged him to reflect on tone and timing. Both men found themselves at the center of a conversation larger than either of them. Days passed, but the discussion did not fade. Articles appeared that attempted deeper analysis. They spoke about generational differences, about changing standards of public discourse, about how media amplifies conflict. The moment was no longer just about two individuals. It had become symbolic. Behind closed doors, both sides considered their next steps. Neither rushed to speak publicly. Silence for now felt safer. The hosts prepared for their next episode knowing they would be asked about it. They practiced responses that were honest but careful. They wanted to acknowledge the moment without feeding the fire. When the next show aired, the atmosphere was calmer. There was no direct mention of what had happened. Still, viewers watched closely, searching for signs, reading between lines. Some felt relieved that things had returned to normal. Others felt disappointed, wanting answers that would never fully come. The guest in the studio from that day returned to his quiet routine. Those close to him said he felt at peace with his choice. He believed that knowing when to step back matters just as much as knowing when to speak. The other guest continued to speak openly in different spaces, where format allowed longer expression. He stood by his beliefs, even while acknowledging that the moment had been difficult. Time moved on as it always does, but the memory of that episode remained. For many viewers, it became a reminder of how quickly conversations can shift, how live television magnifies emotion, and how even respected voices can clash when values collide. What started as a planned discussion had turned into a moment of reflection for millions. And the story was far from over. The days that followed brought a strange mix of noise and quiet. Online, the conversation stayed loud. Offline, the people involved moved carefully, choosing their steps with intention. It felt like standing in the calm center of a storm while everything spun around the edges. The network began internal reviews. Meetings filled the schedule. Producers replayed footage not to point fingers, but to understand how the moment unfolded. They spoke about pacing, interruptions, and the pressure of live television. Everyone agreed on one thing. Once emotions rise on air, there is no pause button. The hosts met privately to talk through their feelings. They cared deeply about the show and the audience. They wanted open discussion, but not at the cost of respect. One host admitted feeling torn, wishing she had found the perfect words in the moment. Another reminded her that perfection does not exist on live TV. Outside the studio, viewers continued to share personal stories. Some said the moment reminded them of family arguments where no one truly listens. Others said it showed the importance of boundaries at work. The story kept shifting shape as it passed from person to person. Late one evening, a longer clip surfaced online, showing more of the discussion before the break. It added context but also raised new questions. People slowed the video down, analyzed expressions, and debated intent. The focus moved from what was said to how it was said. Opinion pieces followed. Writers spoke about how experience can shape communication styles. They talked about how some people value restraint while others value urgency. The clash, they argued, was less about right or wrong and more about approach. Meanwhile, the guest who remained on set spent time away from public spaces. He returned to familiar routines, finding comfort in quiet work. Those close to him noticed that he seemed reflective, not defensive. He understood that moments like these invite judgment, even when intentions are clear. The other guest continued engaging with audiences elsewhere. In longer formats, he explained his perspective calmly. He acknowledged that the talk show environment is fast and limiting. He also admitted that passion can sometimes come across stronger than intended. Neither side attacked the other directly. That restraint surprised many observers. Instead of escalating the conflict, both seemed to step back, allowing the conversation to mature. The network released another short message days later, thanking viewers for their engagement and reminding everyone that respectful dialogue remains the goal. It was brief and careful. Still, the reactions poured in. Some viewers wanted an apology. Others wanted a debate. Many simply wanted clarity. The lack of a dramatic response frustrated those who expected confrontation, but reassured those who valued calm resolution. Behind the scenes, the show made small adjustments. Hosts agreed on clearer signals to step in earlier when discussions heat up. Producers refined communication during breaks. These changes were quiet, invisible to most viewers, but meaningful to those involved. As the week ended, the intensity began to soften. New stories took the spotlight. Social media attention drifted, as it always does. Yet the moment lingered in conversations about media and discourse. In interviews unrelated to the incident, subtle references appeared. A comment about listening more. A line about choosing words carefully. Nothing direct, but enough for attentive audiences to notice. Fans who supported one side or the other slowly found common ground. Many agreed that the situation showed how difficult real conversations can be, especially when watched by millions. One evening, a respected media figure spoke about the incident on a podcast. He described it not as a scandal but as a mirror, a reflection of how society struggles to talk across differences. The comment resonated widely. The hosts felt the weight of that idea. They entered the next tapings with renewed focus. They encouraged discussion but also modeled patience. Viewers noticed the shift. The show felt steadier, more intentional. Weeks later, the moment was referenced less as breaking news and more as a case study. Journalism classes discussed it. Media panels used it as an example. The heat had cooled, leaving room for thought. For the people at the center of it, life continued. Careers moved forward. Projects progressed. Yet the experience stayed with them, shaping how they approached future conversations. One learned the value of drawing clear lines. The other reflected on timing and space. Both carried lessons forward. The audience, too, learned something. Many realized that disagreement does not need to end in disrespect, and that silence can sometimes be a choice, not a weakness. What once felt like a sudden clash had become something more lasting. A reminder that words matter, setting matters, and listening matters most of all. The story no longer belonged to a single show or a single moment. It belonged to everyone who watched, reacted, and reflected. And as the dust finally settled, one truth remained clear. Real conversations are messy, human, and rarely perfect. That is what made the moment unforgettable. As more time passed, the story began to settle into something quieter, but deeper. It was no longer about shock or surprise. It became about meaning. People who had followed the moment closely started asking not who won, but what it revealed. In living rooms and online forums, discussions changed tone. Instead of short reactions, longer thoughts appeared. Viewers talked about how difficult it is to speak honestly without being misunderstood. Some admitted they had seen themselves in the tension, either as the one pushing hard to be heard or the one pulling back to keep peace. Media analysts took a closer look at how live television handles strong voices. They pointed out that talk shows are built for quick exchanges, not long explanations. When emotions rise, there is little room to slow down. This structure, they argued, can turn even thoughtful people into opponents. The network quietly reviewed future guest plans, not to avoid strong opinions but to prepare better for them. Producers discussed balance, timing, and clearer expectations before going live. These conversations stayed behind closed doors, but they shaped what came next. The hosts felt changed by the experience. They became more intentional with pauses, allowing guests to finish thoughts fully. They asked follow-up questions that invited clarity instead of reaction. Viewers noticed the difference even if they could not name it. The guest who had stayed calm throughout the incident continued his work away from television. Those around him said he valued the space the moment gave him to reflect. He believed that not every disagreement needs to be resolved publicly. Some things, he felt, are better understood over time. The other guest also reflected, though in his own way. In later appearances, he spoke about the importance of matching message to moment. He did not regret speaking from the heart, but he acknowledged that timing and setting can shape how words are received. Neither man spoke directly about the other. That absence spoke loudly. It showed restraint and perhaps respect, even in disagreement. Fans who once argued fiercely online began to soften. As weeks passed, the urgency faded. People moved on to other stories, but the lesson remained under the surface. A few universities included the clip in media studies discussions. Students talked about power, tone, and responsibility. They debated whether live platforms help or hurt meaningful dialogue. The moment became educational rather than sensational. One evening, a viewer shared a simple comment that gained attention. They wrote that the incident reminded them that listening is harder than speaking, but more important. The message spread quietly, without anger, and many agreed. Inside the studio, life continued. New guests came and went. Laughter returned. The familiar rhythm slowly rebuilt itself. Still, the memory stayed with the crew, guiding how they handled future tension. There was no public reconciliation scene, no dramatic apology, and surprisingly, people accepted that. The absence of spectacle felt appropriate. It matched the maturity of the moment. Instead of closure through words, there was closure through change. Subtle shifts in tone. Better conversations. Strong opinions shared with more care. The audience, too, became more aware. They listened more closely. They noticed when voices overlapped and when silence spoke louder than words. They learned that disagreement does not always need to end loudly. As the story faded from headlines, it gained something more lasting. Perspective. It showed how two respected figures could clash without becoming enemies. How a tense moment could lead to growth instead of damage. How restraint and passion, though different, both come from caring deeply. In the end, the incident was remembered less for the interruption and more for the reflection that followed. It became a quiet lesson wrapped inside a loud moment. And that lesson continued to travel, long after the cameras stopped rolling. By the time months had passed, the moment no longer felt sharp. It had softened into memory, the way intense experiences often do. People remembered how it made them feel more than the exact words that were spoken. And that feeling carried meaning. In quiet ways, the incident had changed how many people thought about conversation. Viewers began noticing tone more than volume. They paid attention to pauses, to moments when someone chose not to respond right away. Silence, once seen as weakness by some, started to feel thoughtful instead. The show continued its usual rhythm, but something had shifted beneath the surface. The hosts seemed more grounded. They listened longer. They allowed moments to breathe. When disagreement came, it felt less like a battle and more like an exchange. Guests noticed the difference too. Some spoke later about feeling more space to finish their thoughts. Others appreciated the gentle guidance when discussions grew heated. The changes were small, but they mattered. The guest who had drawn a clear line that day carried on with his life quietly. Those around him said he rarely brought up the incident. When asked privately, he described it as a moment where values met pressure. He believed that staying true to oneself does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like knowing when to stop. The other guest also moved forward. In conversations elsewhere, he continued to speak with passion, but with added awareness. He learned how setting shapes message, and how being heard sometimes requires slowing down. The experience did not silence him. It refined him. Both paths showed growth, even if it happened in different ways. Over time, fans stopped choosing sides and started sharing reflections. Some said the moment helped them rethink how they speak at work. Others said it changed how they listen at home. A few even said it helped them step away from arguments that were going nowhere. The media world moved on, as it always does. New stories replaced old ones. Yet this moment lingered in conversations about respect, boundaries, and expression. What made it lasting was not the tension itself, but the lack of spectacle afterward. There was no shouting match replayed endlessly. No public feud. Just a pause, followed by adjustment. That pause mattered. It reminded people that not every conflict needs a loud ending. Some end quietly, with understanding growing in the space left behind. Looking back, the incident became less about television and more about humanity. About how even experienced voices can struggle when emotions run high. About how dignity can exist alongside disagreement. The audience learned that live moments are fragile. Once words leave the mouth, they cannot be taken back. But responses can still shape the outcome. In classrooms, offices, and homes, people referenced the moment without naming it. They spoke about choosing calm over reaction. About listening without preparing a response. About knowing when to step away. The show itself became a subtle example of evolution. Not through announcements or speeches, but through behavior. Through better pacing. Through respect shown in small ways. And for those who watched that day, the memory stayed vivid. Not because of drama, but because it felt real, unpolished, human. In the end, the story did not belong to a headline. It belonged to the quiet lessons people carried forward. It showed that strength can look like restraint, and passion can exist without control being lost. That is why the moment stayed with so many. Not as a clash, but as a reminder. A reminder that how we speak matters. And how we listen matters even more.